Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for checking out this episode of Allow Me to Introduce. My guest today is Kevin Misher, founder of Misher Films and executive producer of Audible's latest podcast series, American Football, How the Gridiron Was Forged. Today, Kevin tells me all about how this project was created, what the audience will learn from listening to this series, and things he learned as a studio production president that have helped him in his career. And with that, allow me to introduce Kevin Misher. So, Kevin, before we dive into your projects and your career, as a Jersey guy, you were raised in Queens. I have to ask, is it Jets or Giants for you?
Jets. Although with this podcast, diving into the lore of the Giants, I've got quite a bit of affection for the Giants now, and they're sort of the family of fans. But we grew up in the shadow of Shea Stadium, so that's sort of first and painfully first.
Well, I'm going to take your first answer as Jets, as a Jets fan myself. That's what I wanted to hear. But you're here to talk about the new podcast series you've produced, American Football, How the Gridiron Was Forged. It's a new series that tells the story behind America's most popular sport, narrated by actress Kate Mara, presented by Hall of Famer Michael Strahan. Your company, Misher Films, also with Smack Productions and the History Channel, with additional production services by High Five Content, put this together, and all 8 episodes of this first season are available now on Audible. I listened to all 8 episodes, binged them all.
Oh my God, thank you.
There's so many incredible stories that, I consider myself a big football historian. So many stories that I had no idea even existed. How do you even begin to tell a story like this that's so complex? Like, where do you even start?
I think that was the tricky part, is that first off, it's a story that's never really been told in its totality anywhere. I mean, honestly, baseball's been oft picked over by both the literary and the mainstream media. Everybody from the left to the right have sort of embraced baseball historically, but football obviously is currently, and probably for the foreseeable future, our nation's most popular sport. And what we found was that there was an actual origin story of, we all knew that football was a rough combination of soccer and rugby, but the fact that the league of the NFL and the professional game was had a very distinct origin story. That was something that was sort of a eureka moment. And the other thing, this thing just doesn't come from the swamps. It comes from people who really sort of fought low expectations, if any expectations, and really a system that was in place to prevent them from doing this. And the discovery of that sort of led us to sort of put together sort of a roadmap through all these people, from Jim Thorpe to Fritz Pollard to George Halas to Joe Carr to Red Grange, people of great character, great integrity, who really were forging ahead despite all of the obstacles in their way. Most notably were who knew that there was even going to be a market for this. And most notably, what was really most interesting is that the game of football was founded as a sport of the elite, sport of the Ivy Leagues. Everybody knew it was sort of Rutgers and Harvard and Yale's and all of those universities that had created it. But it really came at a very distinct moment in time when America as a country, in the national psyche, nobody thought that war was going to be a part of the American culture anymore. And the elite, who had always sort of tested the mettle of young men on the fields of battle, that was how the leaders of America had always been born since our country's origin. They created football. Little did they know World War I was coming shortly in the distance. This was after the Spanish Civil War, but they thought football had this mix of strategy and warfare, and could be organized in a way that an audience would watch, and it did. It was incredibly popular in the colleges, but there was no contemplation that it was a professional game, or that the masses, other than watching the very privileged people of this country do it, nobody thought that the masses would embrace it as wildly as they did. And really what happened was it became a proving ground to African Americans, Native Americans, and immigrants of this country to sort of prove that they belonged as well. And finding that story was actually what made us go, oh, you know what? Here's a great tale with great characters.
Well, there were so many things that put the long-term sustainability in jeopardy. Players were traded and changed teams just before games started. Owners who considered themselves enemies had to swear truce for the betterment of the league. Was this a theme of just something is new, right? And there's so many hurdles that are obviously going to come along the way, but it was the fine tuning of those hurdles whenever they came up and the willingness to adapt that helped the game in the long run in its infancy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it probably was unique to the game itself. Football changes its rules often, and many over decades, over years, over sometimes over seasons, right? And it's unique in that aspect, right? The other sports sort of have a fixed set of rules and have had them for a long time. Baseball is only now adapting, right, to sort of for marketability, right? But it's interesting that football was a rules breaker, right? I think Sally Jenkins of the Washington Post even says that, right? It somehow reflects our national character, right? And I think that was what gave it both its life and its vibrancy and its sustainability. That it was incredibly adaptable to the times, and it's a reflection. Again, this is sort of another sort of sub theme of it all, right? Is we posit that our national character is wrapped up in this game, right? It's messy, it's tough, it's strategic, right? You're trying to move an inch, and sometimes it's very painful, and sometimes it's glorious and beautiful, right? And it has all of those things that we love. I was watching the World Cup recently, and there was a really interesting article that I read. I can't remember who wrote it, but it was about how somebody said soccer isn't an American game. And by the way, I'm obsessed with the World Cup, so I'm not sure I agree with it. But what I thought was interesting, the point is that American characters, when you do your best and you prove yourself on the pitch or the field of play, you should win, right? There should be winners and losers based on sort of the effort of this and the spirit with which you engage in battle. And that's a very uniquely American thing, and that's what football has.
Well, because this required a lot of kind of digging back into the archives, because you're going way back over 100 years ago. What was the most challenging thing during the production process?
Well, there was a number of sort of challenging moments, I would say. The first was sort of breaking the story. My partner in this at my company is Andy Berman, who did an incredible amount of research to sort of pave the path of all of the story elements, right? So that it wasn't just, there's no book, right? As I said, so it's not like you go, oh, here's the story, let's go do that. So it really was a sort of painstaking thing to, we come from, I've predominantly done movies. I would say exclusively done movies up until this podcast. And so we wanted to bring a very cinematic feel to it. And that has there's certain sort of underlying sort of narrative rules that we were looking and, developing characters in a certain way. And there were limitations to the form, but also opportunities in the form. And so what we did is finding the pieces where you could see the handoff, pun intended, I guess, from Jim Thorpe to Fritz Pollard to George Halas, and then watching the fact that the game goes from the small towns of Ohio to the big Midwestern cities like Chicago, and then hopscotches across the country to New York as it sort of blows itself up into a truly national game. That was actually something that was really hard to figure out. It actually took a couple of years, right? Then the other part was assembling all the elements. We had for a long time assumed that we would tell the story filmically. But the cost of doing a period production and doing the game justice on the field is quite difficult. Very early in my career, and perhaps we'll talk about that, one of my first movies that I worked on was Rudy. And, to represent the game in the way that people see the game in their heads and are used to seeing the game on film is very, very difficult, right? You could probably look at the films that did it well and didn't do it well, and you know them instantly, right? Because it's a tactile thing. So I think what we were trying to do was make sure that we could tell the story right. So we pivoted to this podcast form when we realized we could do it. And Michael Strahan and his partner, Constance Schwartz-Marini, coming aboard was instrumental. The NFL was helpful to us in telling the story. Though it's a story that's told independently of them, it is ultimately about them or telling about their fathers and grandfathers and great grandfathers. So it's very much tied up in the sort of the DNA of the league. And then Michael and brought Kate in, obviously a scion of two football families, which is amazing, and an extraordinary actress in her own right. That was a real get for us. And then there was sort of a number of other key elements, which was trying to find a way to take. You're interested in the history and the history of sport and the history of culture. but not everybody is, right? And it's the type of thing where a lot of people sort of tune out when it starts to feel sepia toned. So we were like, how do we make this vibrant? And one of the things that I think hopefully was very apparent is that all the issues that were happening in 1920 are current. They're the same issues. The storylines repeat every 5, 10, 15, 20 years over and over and over. And so we brought it through Michael and Constance, helped bring in these very contemporary voices, from Peyton Manning to Aaron Rodgers to Hall of Famers like Mike Ditka, and a host of others. And what we were able to do was use contemporary voices, both their knowledge of their history and also their ability to tell the story from their point of view, whether it's a field's eye view, a sideline's eye view, or an executive suite's eye view. That gave it a tactile feel that made it feel very vibrant. And then the last sort of dose of reality, which I think for me is the special sauce of it, is having the announcers do contemporary announcers do live recreations of old games. And, hearing Chris Berman say, he could go all the way, talking about a game in the 1920s, it's just fantastic.
Well, so I think the audience for this is so large because it's not just for football fans. It's also a history documentary. What's something that you'd like the audience to either learn or take out from listening to this series that maybe going in they weren't expecting?
I think that there's I would say there's two different levels, right? I think if you love the game, you're going to learn more about the game. And if you're one of those guys who plays Madden and dissects on drive time sports radio, and you're dissecting every last little minute of every play and every move and every piece of every game, there's an interesting aspect of our show where you can actually feel. Hopefully, you felt it. Sort of, you can feel and see the moments where the game evolved. We didn't dive too deeply into them because it's not total. It shouldn't only be for geeks. It should be for all fans, and by the way, all audiences should be able to enjoy it as a character piece, as I said. But I think the thing that was most important for have fidelity to the fan was making sure that the growth of the game itself. You can see the forward pass. You can see the points from field goals change in real time, right? You can actually feel it. And in fact, as you saw when the youngest brother of that family of Nessers, our Hanson brothers, right, is standing on the field at the end, we even make a moment where it's like, wow, how much the game has changed. And then there's sort of the fact that football, and this I think is sort of to the general audience, to anybody, is that football always has been the engine of the entertainment industrial complex of this nation, right? And that actually was sort of a secondary or tertiary discovery that was sort of delightful, right? Is that Red Granger's doing movies. He was on Wheaties boxes. And there was a moment in time where one or two, George Halas and CeCe Pyle, this agent, had these ideas that were not commonplace, now seem so de rigueur, right? But what happened back then was somebody had to think of, this will sell, right? And so those two angles, I think, create this vibrancy to the show where it's like, oh, I really didn't know that. And it's a story that, as you said, it was important for us after breaking the story and discovering it. We wanted to get it down somewhere, right? Like Ken Burns got the baseball documentary done. I mean, we should be so lucky and so gloriously received as that wonderful piece. But we got it down and we told the story, and it's all factual.
Well, what's funny, not funny, but interesting is in episode 8, you had mentioned Red Grange going on to do films, and then you have Peyton and Eli Manning talking about how they started getting into doing commercials, and it's almost like people nowadays can see the correlation of it's not too different from back then that it is now. And I thought that was just fascinating, where it's these little things where it's like you think about old football and you're like, oh, it's nothing like it is now. Well, in all honesty, sure, it's developed and evolved, but there are some core similarities. And I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah, we love that. And, even the animosity, on the field animosity between the Bears and the Packers, right? It came from a place, and that'll be part of season 2. It will drive the subsequent popularity of the league to get even bigger. So those discoveries for the fan, can geek out on it, and for the general audience member you're watching, George Hallis and Curly Lambeau, who hopefully we make feel flesh and blood, understand why the two teams don't like each other.
Well, and I also think fans now watching a Bears game, they see, George Hallis's initials on their sleeves. Now they know what those initials actually mean.
Yeah.
But I wanted to jump backwards for a minute and look at your career journey. One thing I find so interesting is that nobody's path is ever the same, right? There's always twists and turns that nobody can replicate. You graduated from Penn with a degree in economics, but then jumped right into the entertainment industry as a financial analyst at HBO. Did you always know you wanted to get into entertainment? Or did it take some time to kind of feel out and see where you fit in?
No, the business school thing was the divot. Everything else was sort of geared towards it. Grew up, as we talked about earlier. I grew up in Queens. My father was a dentist. My mom had a small business and was a homemaker for many years. And I didn't have any connections to the business and movie making or making television shows, whatever it was, just seemed so far away and distant. I didn't know how. I didn't know that there was a path to get there. So, but I always loved movies. That was sort of the common theme in my life. I was the type of kid who always walked out of every movie and just said, "Oh, that was my favorite movie ever." So Penn was the best school I got into, pretty good school, and so it was really it was an opportunity to just go to terrific school. Not so very significantly, it was not so far from home, which was important at that time in my life. My parents, we all, everybody sort of stayed sheltered. I wasn't equipped to travel cross country at the age of 18. But when I got out, I got a job at HBO and I was doing finance. Michael Fuchs, who was the then CEO, I was very fortunate. I sort of did a little trick that worked. I put personal and confidential on all of my employment submission letters. And it so happened that Michael Fuchs, who legendary CEO of HBO, he had a temp that day and read it and liked the letter, brought me in and gave me a job. But it was a financial job, which was what I was coming from. I was coming from Wharton. So it was the job that I thought was right for me. And I was tangentially involved with the entertainment business at that point. Obviously, HBO then and now was a big mover of product. And at that point, it was really, really on its upshoot, creating itself. But I wasn't really involved in any of the creativity. So I started to read scripts freelance and just on the side for nothing, frankly, just to sort of get experience. And the guy who worked at HBO, who was in charge of that department, I just asked him and said, how do I do this and not the finance job? And he said, you should move to LA. You'll have a better opportunity at it. And so I did. Right. And at that point, I just ripped the Band-Aid and, sort of within a month, hopped in a plane, severed the elements of my life that I needed to, got rid of the apartment, broke up with the girlfriend. It was like all the traditional, like storybook stuff, like you shouldn't do. And I just did. And then I was, again, fortunate enough out there that I was able to get a job in a mailroom. And then I had a very traditional path. The mailroom is obviously the story place where everybody begins. But that was so the school was the pivot. It was necessary because it gave me confidence in an education and an understanding of business that I couldn't have gotten otherwise. That really helped me. And also when I got out to LA at that period of time, is the entertainment business was a little like Wild Billy's circus story, to use a Springsteen metaphor. There, it's like the business. It wasn't like the media business back then, as somebody once said to me. It really was like a circus act, because it was localized, right? It wasn't the colleges of this country or people who wanted to be in the hot business. There wasn't there, and there still isn't a real path, but there was really no path. So it was opportunistically a really good time for me to do it, and I had a nice trajectory at the beginning because I think I came out with a lot of energy and ambition and a work ethic that had been born of the hard work that I had done previously, and gave me an opportunity pretty quickly to do some good stuff. Hopefully some good stuff. People can judge that.
Well, you ended up at TriStar, worked on some movies like you mentioned, Rudy. We'll we'll debate whether he was onside or offside. But then at the age of 33, you moved from TriStar to Universal Studios, where you became the president of production, again, at the ripe age of 33. Was there anything that may have caught you off guard from jumping into such a prominent role?
Well, the business was different back then. Now I'm like an old hand, so that sounds like something people used to tell me, but it's a very different business then and now. Like I think again, as I said, the opportunity there in those days was that there was a lot of opportunity, right? And movies were the apex of the entertainment product. There wasn't YouTube and shorts and TikTok. There was nothing else. And even in the hierarchy between movies and television, movies were the A type entertainment, right? It was where the movie stars were. And now, funny, I just was reading, I think today something came out about, where have all the movie stars gone? And I could debate that because I think there are some really wonderful movie stars who everybody will go see. But the interesting thing for me back in the day is that I always knew that if I found, I had a lot of confidence in my taste, and that was borne out by reading a lot of scripts. And then over time, you start to be like, oh, the ones that I'm liking are the ones getting made, and the ones that I liked a lot are the better ones. And there are reasons sometimes why they're better or not. But generally, I started to feel a level of confidence with my choices. So I started to realize that if I could get a movie star, who mattered at the box office, interested in the material that I liked and was pushing, I could get a movie made. And that was sort of the basic rules of the day. And that if I gave a script without a movie star to my boss, there was a 50-50 shot. That's probably a great shot, right? But 50-50 shot that they were going to like it. If I gave that same script to them with Brad Pitt interested, they were going to love it and want to make it, right? So that was how it was easier back then. I didn't need IP necessarily, although that came into play later. But those were those early days where it was less of a chess game. Certainly there were moves to make, but there was less of a.
There was the more simple recipe than it is now.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So in 2001, you left Universal to form Misher Films. What was your vision at that time when you decided to start your own company, and why was it the right time then to do it?
I didn't have any vision. I really didn't have any vision. It was a little more complicated than just leaving. It was one of those things, everybody gets fired from their job. So it was a little more complicated than just straightforward, but it was half my doing and half not my doing. I don't know that time and place was necessarily my choice, right? Sort of like when you run a studio, it's like being a coach or a manager. Your half-life is ticking from the second the job starts. I had a really great run, so I was looking for something different inside the job that the job couldn't provide. I don't honestly know that I had a vision when I started, and I had been a lifelong executive. And executive and a producer sit on opposite sides of the same table, but the jobs are distinct, right? One sort of provides the resource capital for the product and then manages it from the bench or from the booth, right? The other person is on the line doing all of the work. And it was a new experience for me, honestly. Like, I had never been out on a set for, days and weeks and months, and managing every last, ebb and flow of a production. So, frankly, that was, the management of those first few movies was so challenging for me that, I would say I couldn't get to the vision, right? I was trying to stay above water all the time. Again, I knew what I was doing to get movies made and to get, I would hope, a reasonable quality of product in the marketplace, both from a commercial side and a creative side. So I was able to continue to work, but it took a few years of dog paddling, as it were, to get to the place where I could be like, oh, there's my North Star. So, I wouldn't say I started my company with sort of a grand, here's what we're going to do. I probably had 15 of them, all of which, sort of crashed and burned and built the next one up on the ashes of the previous one.
So coming full circle now, American football is the first audio storytelling project of Misher Films. Is this something that you want to do more of in the future?
Oh yeah, I loved it. I loved it. First off, the greatest thing is I stayed at home. I mean, not literally at home, but I was in LA with I have a family, and I have an office, and I have people who I work with, who are Andy Berman, as I said, and some other people whom I love, and they all work really hard, and I love to be with them, right? And it's great in a very creative, vibrant environment. And so going away on production, obviously you're focused on that one thing and you got to make it great. But what's great about this was we were able to do it in the office every day, so that the vibrancy of that was terrific. I also like the sort of the instantaneousness of it. Developing a story like this, it's not easier, it's different, but there's a straightforwardness to it where the plot mechanics have to work. We were imparting some whatever rules and instincts that we usually apply to movies into the story of American football, and hopefully that makes it really vibrant and the characters pop, and they're not just, again, sort of like names that you've heard, but they're real flesh and blood people. I mean, George Hallis, his mother didn't want him to play football, right? Whose mother didn't say don't play football, right?
Everybody can relate, yeah.
Yeah, and so we worked really hard for those moments, but those moments, once they happened, you could, pass it over to our production. The production and gave it to Kate. Kate read it, and then you can start to build sort of the math of, let's see if we can get Peyton. Make sure when Peyton comes in, he's going to give us 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever it was. Make sure we ask him what it was like to come back from injury, right? So he could reflect those moments. The really challenging part of it, sometimes you miss those moments, right? Because you're sort of like, we were rebooting story at the same time we were doing interviews, just the nature of this particular production. So sometimes we're like, we didn't get Peyton to say what he wants. We need so-and-so. So those things were different. It's like, did we get Eli Manning to talk about what it's like to, go down the Canyon of Heroes, right? Because Jim Thorpe did that, right? We're just adding the Jim Thorpe thing. So those were things that were happening on the fly, but those all happen in a very compressed environment. And the other thing last thing I'll say about this that was great was it was a very compressed environment. After all those years of research, the green light to airing has been about 3.5 months. And the speed to create 8 episodes that held together and edit out the volume of the other information that could have been, it was sort of exhilarating. It was like running a marathon at a sprinter's pace. It was sort of crazy, but fun. Like a 2-minute drill at every moment.
That's great. Now, I want to finish up by asking you for some context, because doing my background research, before speaking with you, I stumbled upon the always reliable Wikipedia, and this sounded way too detailed to not be true. So I had to ask. The line reads, while Misher has an accomplished film career, he is best known for his game-winning shot in the 1980 Camp Equinunk, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, upper senior basketball game. Yeah. Is that true?
I really thought you were going to challenge me on like an arcane sports fact that we got wrong.
Oh,
and
no.
The fact that that's what I thought you were going to do. I think you're going to be like, George Hallis did this and so, and you guys said this. That somebody's put that on my Wikipedia. I have no idea who put that on, but I went to sleepaway camp like many boys in of my era then and now, I guess. And, like all great Jewish East Coast kids, their greatest sports moment happens in sleepaway camp. So that was mine. And somebody by the way, I've taken that off or tried to have it taken off like 5 times, and they always sneak it back in. And I have no idea who put it on. It was not me.
Now, so we were talking before we came on about Bruce Springsteen, and I'm a huge Springsteen fan. With your Billy Circus reference, I assume you are as well. What are the must-listen-to albums for somebody trying to get into Springsteen?
Well, I think you got to do the classics, right? You got to do Born to Run. I mean, he on that Howard Stern interview he just did, he was talking about, that's the album that, the song and album that's going to follow him. Darkness was my first album. And then my sort of core was the Darkness was the first one I heard at camp, ironically. Then The River was the first sort of real-time album for me and the first shows that I saw. So I have a very deep connection to The River, and I loved going to see the tour. Was it the last tour where it was all River all the time?
2016, right?
But my favorite album is Wild the Innocent and the Street Shuffle.
Okay.
So I have a dog named Rosalita. So there you go. Nothing more needs to be said after that.
That's perfect. That's really great. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for taking the time to talk today. I really appreciate it. And I hope we could speak again soon. Again, all 8 episodes of season 1 are out right now. Please go check it out. Kevin, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Good fun.